Shwmae Bawb, hello. Thank you for joining me for this short presentation on native learners. So I'll start by talking about what a native speaker is. And in academic circles, there's lots of discussion about what a native speaker is or how a native speaker should be defined. So they ask questions such as, can someone who learnt two languages as a child be classed as a native speaker in both of those languages? Or is a child who learns a language very late, say when they're 11 or 12, can they be classed as a native speaker? Or what about those native speakers who move to a foreign country and then their language abilities start to attrite or start to become less because they've been exposed to other languages and used their first language less? Are those people still native speakers? And also, can you become a native speaker if you're a learner, if you're really good, if you achieve some kind of native level proficiency? Well, we can park all of that for the moment, because for those of us who are engaged in the business of learning and teaching languages, for us, native speaker is the target. It's about what we compare ourselves against. Native speaker for us is some kind of automatic ability, some kind of good ability that's simply better than us. So for us, native speaker is often what we're aiming for. We might not get there, but it's always the target. So then we've got a simple distinction between native speakers on the one hand and learners on the other. But this really only refers to lots of global contexts in which you have foreign people learning foreign languages. So you might have, for example, Turkish-speaking immigrants in Germany learning German, or you might have a Hungarian language enthusiast learning Welsh in Budapest. So these people are at some level removed from the context in which they're learning the languages. They're from another country, they're from another context. But this kind of situation isn't true in all countries. And I'll talk a bit about that in a second. But for those learners in these global contexts, what can happen is that they can transfer things from their first language to their second language. And this kind of transfer can be positive or it can be negative. So if you're a German speaker and you're learning Swedish or one of the Scandinavian languages, for example, you'll be already familiar with nice front rounded vowels like and you can probably use your German and your other front rounded vowels in your Scandinavian target language, no problem. But transfer can also be negative. For example, if you're a Spanish speaker and you're learning English, you might find it difficult to distinguish between the words sheet and shit, or beach and bitch, for example. And that would be classed as negative transfer. But as I mentioned, in lots of contexts, this kind of distinction between learners and native speakers is sort of blurred. So for the last 4 years, I've been working with a group of learners I call native learners. And these are people who are from Wales and are learning Welsh. And they kind of sit between learners and speakers. So in this research I've been conducting, native just means someone who was raised in the area in which they continue to live. So a Welsh person who's brought up in Wales but doesn't speak Welsh and then decides to learn the language as an adult. And I've been comparing these native speakers against people, these native learners, sorry, against non-native learners, so learners from England. So two different groups of learners, learners from Wales learning Welsh and learners from England learning Welsh. But these native learners aren't just native because they happen to grow up in Wales. That would be maybe a bit too simple. They're also native learners because the kind of English they speak has Welsh kind of properties. So when communities of people stopped speaking Welsh and they started speaking English, the majority dominant and economic dominant language, they kind of transferred some features into English, and this became the kind of accents of English that we have in Wales today, Welsh dialects. And these kind of transferred features from Welsh that got transferred into English and became part of what we call Welsh English, we can call the Welsh substrate. And these substrate features can be grammatical things. So they can be things like on the table it is, when people who speak Welsh English focus or front information that's more important. On the table it is, over there I was, under the sofa it is. But it can also be borrowing words. So for example, tup is a word that means stupid, but it's a word that people say all over Wales, whether they speak Welsh or not, and it's borrowed from English. But I've been looking at some features of intonation and pronunciation. So these are features that were borrowed into Welsh English from Welsh. And one is quite an idiomatic one that lots of people are aware of. It's this kind of melodic up and down property that Welsh has, Welsh intonation has, and Welsh English intonation has. A kind of up and down intonation across entire sentences. So in my study, what I did is I recorded lots of people, so native learners, non-native learners, and native speakers, and I looked to see at their kind of up and down intonation patterns. And here are all the kind of patterns I found. I categorized them into different broad categories, and I looked particularly then at these kind of patterns, these Welsh kind of patterns, where there's an up and down intonation across the entire sentence. And they sound a bit like this.
Mae William yn byw yn yr Alban. Mae William yn byw yn yr Alban.
So that's a native learner from West Wales saying the sentence, Mae William yn byw yn yr Alban, which means William lives in Scotland. Here's another one.
Mae William yn byw yn yr Alban. Mae William yn byw yn yr Alban.
So these kind of up and down patterns are very characteristic of Welsh, and they're very characteristic of Welsh English. So I wanted to look at how these different groups of speakers used those patterns. And all of these patterns I called sawtooth, because they sort of went up and down in a sawtooth style.
Mae William yn byw...
And then this is what I found. Here's a little graph, and I'll talk you through it. So I've got two different groups. I've got some people from Southeast Wales and some people from Southwest Wales. And then if we look first at the native speakers and native learners in the Southeast, well, they're using this up and down sawtooth pattern over 50% of the time. And they use them almost the same amount. So native speakers and native learners, when they're speaking Welsh, in terms of their intonation, you can't really tell them apart. So they are kind of, the native learners in that area of Wales seem to be better than the non-native learners. They seem to have some kind of advantage. They're using this up and down pattern to the same extent that native speakers of the language they're learning are using it. But in the Southwest, I found something slightly different. So here, the native learners sound too native. They sound too good. They sound so authentic that they sound inauthentic. So here in the Southwest, the native learners overuse this up and down intonation pattern over 70% of the time. And they use it on all kinds of sentences. So whether they're questions, whether they're declaratives, they use the same up and down intonation pattern far more than native speakers do. And when I looked at their English speech, I couldn't see that that was something that had been transferred from English. So it seems to be some kind of performative thing. These people grew up in an area of Wales where they can hear Welsh around them, but they did not speak Welsh themselves. So maybe they are using their familiarity with Welsh and they're noticing this up and down pattern and they're deliberately reproducing it in a way that sounds quite native initially, but then seems to go way beyond being native. And they sound so native that they become non-native. So here we've got a mixed picture. In one area, we've got the native learners being better than non-native learners. So Welsh people being better at Welsh than English people. That's not terribly surprising. But in the Southwest, we've got a different situation. We've got the Welsh learners, the people from Wales, being so authentically Welsh that they sound quite non-native. So in the Southwest, the group that sounds more native is actually the group that is non-native. So the English people in the southwest were better than the people from Wales. The next thing I looked at, the next thing from Welsh that I looked at was how people stress words. And when we stress words, we have to change our pitch. We have to make segments of sounds louder. And we have to change how we say that part of the word in relation to other parts. So in English, if you want to make something stressed, you generally make that part of the word longer, louder, and higher. In Welsh, what you generally do is you make the stress syllable shorter, you make it quieter, and you make it lower in pitch. So you have something that sounds like canol, canol, down and up. Again, this down and up pattern we see in Welsh. And then when communities started to speak English and stopped speaking Welsh, and we came up with Welsh English, we have the same kind of way of stressing parts of words. So also in Welsh English, stressed syllables are generally shorter, quieter, and lower. Canon, canon. And this is something very idiomatically Welsh. Canon, office, with a kind of down and up pattern. So I thought I'd also look at this. I'd look at my native learners, my non-native learners, and my native speakers, and I try to see whether there were any differences between those three groups in how they stressed words. So I recorded people, lots of people saying hundreds of different words, and I had thousands of different examples. And then I cut out bits of the word. And here's an example of something from the computer program I used to do this. And I looked at the quality of the stressed syllables and the quality of the unstressed syllables. I took measurements of pitch, how loud the sounds were, how long the sounds were, and then I compared both of those. And I was expecting to see, again, that the native learners would be better than the non-native learners. So people from Wales would be better than people from England. But I didn't really find that. So what I found is that everyone was pretty good. There wasn't really a case in which one group was manifestly better than the other, which is strange because the way that things are stressed in Welsh and English are different. But it seems that the learners had either learnt how to stress things in Welsh correctly, or in some areas, the difference between English and Welsh wasn't that great after all. And the descriptions we have are maybe a bit overdone. There was one case, though, in which there were differences between these different groups. And that was in how the pitch changes across entire words. So on these graphs here, I've got some traces of pitch across two-syllable words, words like canon or canol. And you can see then that learners do the same thing in English and in Welsh. In the case of the native learners, though, what they do in Welsh and English is more similar to what native speakers of Welsh do. So you can see that the green line is sort of emulating the shape of the red line. The purple lines then are our non-native learners. Those are people learning Welsh who come from England. And you can see that the way that the pitch changes across their words is that it just goes continually down. But for the people from Wales, learners and speakers alike, there's a little plateau of pitch midway through the word. This was the only example then of the native learners being better than the non-native learners, but it's something quite specific. It's to do with how pitch changes across words. It's not really clear whether this is something we can hear very clearly. It's something that we have to look at using a computer program. And then I looked at some three-syllable words, and in the Southwest, I found again that the patterns of native speakers and native learners were similar, that they differed from the English peoples. But in the Southeast, I found something slightly different. So in the Southeast, these native learners, well, they seem to only really have an advantage when it comes to two-syllable words. When it comes to three-syllable words, we can't tell any difference between native and non-native learners. So any advantage they do have is kind of controlled by the number of syllables. But again, this is a very small advantage. This was surprising because in a recent study of adult tutors of Welsh, over 60% claimed that people from Wales had better intonation and better pronunciation than people from England. It's a very common belief amongst tutors in Wales, both tutors who work for the National Centre for Learning Welsh, so government provided courses, and also people that work privately as Welsh tutors. And it's also something that lots of learners themselves say. So lots of my learners who are English think that they're just not going to get this intonation thing. They think it's always beyond them. Whereas lots of my native learners are quietly confident that they don't need pronunciation training. But the evidence so far then from this study at least is that there's not that much difference, and where the differences are, they're sometimes very minimal, and then they're sometimes gated by things like the length of syllables in a word. So native learners, are they better? Well, maybe they are better in very small ways, in very particular circumstances, but it's not the case that they're simply wholesale better than learners from England. They might have some passive familiarity that they can use, but in some cases we saw that that passive familiarity can make people sound too native to an extent that makes them sound non-native. If you remember those up and down intonation patterns that were overused by native learners in the West. But generally, it's good news. People can acquire the intonation of Welsh, and in some cases, the differences between the two languages don't seem to be as big as are described in textbooks or in academic research from the past. Could there be other groups of native learners? Well, I think yes, and two ideas that I've had to look at recently would be Finnish people learning Finnish Swedish, or perhaps Irish people learning Irish. So people who are from the countries that they're learning the languages of, and also who speak some kind of variety of their first language, which is informed by the language that they're learning, the language that their communities used to speak in the past, in the case of Irish and Welsh. That's it from me. Diolch yn fawr iawn. I'll hang around if there are any questions, but otherwise, diolch yn fawr. Thank you for listening.